So I'm very excited to invite and to introduce Dr. Helmut Maassen, who teaches philosophy at Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf, Germany. He spent research sabbaticals at Boston University and in a university in Delhi, India. He's even taught at Claremont School of Theology in 2007. He's published several books on A.N. Whitehead and Charles Peirce and numerous scholarly articles on these topics. He's also the International Book Review Coordinator for the Germany of Process Studies. He's the editor of the European Studies and Process Thought, something many of us are certainly familiar with. He's the president both of the German Whitehead Society and the president of the European Society for Process Thought. And at present, his work is integrating aesthetics and music, the aesthetics of music. This in particular, I think, makes him an apt moderator for our final session on art, beauty, and creativity. Dr. Maassen.
Well, David, thank you for the kind invitation and lining out what we are up to. But let me first return to what Godehard already said, because Godehard Brüntrup and I are organizing the 13th International Whitehead Conference, which we just took off. Well, anyway, the 13th International Whitehead Conference, July 26th to 29th in Munich in the Hochschule for Philosophy. We have the whole building, he said already, for just our conference, so we won't be bothered by commuting this and that way and so on. So our session is called Art, Beauty, and Creativity, and I suppose David summarized it, the ABCs of process philosophy. I tend to take that very seriously, not just a pun, because I think aesthetics is a major, if not the major tool of understanding Whiteheadian metaphysics. That has not been noticed for a long time, but recently there are several attempts to focus on aesthetics. Obviously, as you mentioned, I'm one among them, but the Sherborne book on Whiteheadian aesthetics has a clue why one can really claim this fundamental function of aesthetics. Because in the preface by Northrop, he writes, in the early 1920s, when he, meaning Alfred North Whitehead, took me page by page and chapter by chapter through principles of natural knowledge and concept of nature, he often stopped to point out the aesthetic character of the concrete fact from which all science, philosophy, and reflection take their inception. I mean, if you take this seriously, one, I think, is allowed, which I did, to talk of the aesthetic turn in Whitehead. Several publications, like the first volume of a critical edition, if you have a chance to look into it under aesthetics, you will see that Whitehead clearly expresses the notion. The fundamental basics of my approach to metaphysics is aesthetics, which is close to what we have here. There are several new books by colleagues from Prague who have been working on Whiteheadian aesthetics. Kenneth Lafavre, whom some of you might know, has published a book which I find a very attractive title. I would have liked to have used it myself. The ontology, the sound of ontology. Sound of ontology. Well, so far to the background of why I think it's really a very important section we are dealing with. And we have three different people with different approaches to our ABC of process philosophy. The first one being Dr. Alex Haitos. He teaches philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University and was a visiting assistant professor at Ashoka University, which is a research university outside Delhi. And we tried to meet. Last time he was there, but not possible, and they got stuck because of the corona lockdown in India. His research intersects span or history of Western philosophy, will focus on metaphysics, process philosophy, and the philosophy of art. And the two of us have edited a volume in the European Studies of Philosophy, Volume 7, which is called Variations on Process Metaphysics. Variations, of course, thinking of musical forms of variation. Alex, it's all yours.
Thank you, Helmut. I'm going to jump right in. So today I'm going to talk about the role of imagination in Whitehead's philosophy. In particular, I shall make the case that imagination is a crucial element in a Whiteheadian cosmos, and that its importance is tied to its role in promoting and securing the aim at aesthetic intensity that characterizes all actual entities. Some other themes will emerge during this exploration, such as the relationship between imagination, freedom, and art, and I shall use John Dewey to help relate art and aesthetic experience to imagination. But much here is preliminary and will be left for the discussion after the talk. Not only are the themes expansive and time short, but I have only recently begun this exploration of Whiteheadian aesthetics from the vantage point of imagination. Whitehead does not write about imagination in a focused way, and so I have more or less taken for granted its role in aesthetic experience in my previous studies of Whitehead. But the role of imagination is important, tied as it is to freedom and the attainment of richer, deeper experience, that is, to the attainment of beauty. Probing this thought is my goal today. The centrality of imagination in Whitehead's philosophical methodology is what prompted this line of inquiry for me. In the opening chapter of Process and Reality, Speculative Philosophy, Whitehead explains and defends the role of speculation or imagination in philosophical and scientific inquiry. Key to Whitehead's account of philosophic method is the idea of imaginative generalization, where a free imagination takes, extends, modifies, and broadens the applicability of concepts originally limited to a certain region of experience. This is the creation of new, more far-reaching, and more powerful ideas in service of the enhancement and illumination of experience. Without imagination, there is no improvement of understanding or of the conditions of life. Since imagination plays an important role in Whitehead's account of philosophic method and the production of knowledge, and since his philosophical system endeavors to frame ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted, we can therefore ask how the importance of imagination is articulated within the system. For example, how does Whitehead characterize imagination in his system, and is it sufficiently robust to account for the importance imagination has in Whitehead's methodology? This is the question that served as the catalyst for the current inquiry. The short answer to the second part of the question is yes. Whitehead's account of imagination within his system coheres with how he uses and treats imagination methodologically. But this is not what I want to focus on right now. Whitehead does not give imagination a focused interpretation within process and reality. Rather, the word is used here and there to describe certain operations within concrescence. It would be easy to read process and reality and not pay the idea all that much heed, overshadowed as it is by much more prevalent notions. For example, prehension, eternal object, extension, proposition, order, intensity, Indeed, I have done this. Yet without imagination, nothing interesting would happen in a Whiteheadian cosmos. And I mean this in a fundamental sense. Without imagination, the complexity in organism and environment requisite for interest to emerge would not be attained. Without imagination, an actual entity cannot affect the adjustment of contrasts that constitutes beauty and delivers the heightened intensity of aesthetic experience. I'm here moving imagination from the terminological periphery of Whitehead's system to the center. There might be a little exaggeration in what I was just saying, but I don't think there's much. My point is that for Whitehead, imagination is closely allied to freedom and life. It is difficult to disentangle these three notions such that they have any meaning apart from the others. They are coherent ideas in Whitehead's sense. Within the technical language of Whitehead's system, imagination is closely related to conceptual reversion, that crucial and frankly mysterious categorical obligation. Reversion and imagination are not identical, at least not wholly. At this point, some sorting through of the ways Whitehead writes about imagination will be helpful. This will clear up what I was just saying about conceptual reversion and will put us on the path to understanding the role of imagination in fostering aesthetic experiences. So, the word imagination and its derivatives appear throughout process and reality, though not to my eyes with a frequency that stands out. Whitehead does not give a systematic exposition of the concept. The most concentrated discussion of imagination in its systematic relations is, unsurprisingly, found in Part 3 of Process and Reality, and particularly in connection with the idea of propositions. But even here, I would not say that Whitehead uses the term consistently in a technical way. Thus, what follows is partly reconstruction, partly interpretation. At the end of Part 3, in the chapter, The Higher Phases of Experience, Whitehead casually suggests that there are three types or species of imagination. These are 1, conceptual imagination, 2, propositional imagination, and 3, conscious imagination. This is the only place where this distinction comes up, and as far as I can tell, it's the only occurrence of conceptual imagination, that phrase, with the meaning that it has here. Yet it's a helpful division, and I'll use it to anchor my discussion. Throughout Part 3, when Whitehead does talk about imagination, he's most frequently talking about propositional imagination. Conscious imagination makes an appearance only at the end of Part 3, and it is the lifting of propositional imagination into consciousness through contrast with what the actual world evidently is, without focus on truth or falsity. The phrase conceptual imagination, as I said, only makes this one appearance. Given the context of Whitehead's discussion, it seems to me that conceptual imagination is a synonym for conceptual reversion. In the phases of concrescence, as complexity is gained, conceptual imagination can develop into propositional imagination, which in turn can develop into conscious imagination. So thus, reversion is the basis of imagination. Reversion meaning that there is not simply the conceptual reproduction of physical feeling, but rather conceptual divergence from physical feeling that emphasizes a relevant possibility not directly derived from the physical feeling. But if not directly derived from where? Imaginatively, I would say. Though, of course, conceptual imagination does not work ex nihilo. It is subject to various categorical conditions, for example, of subjective unity and subjective harmony. And any imaginative decision must take into account the structure of possibility as constituted through God's primordial nature. And parenthetically, this primordial nature is felt by every concressing entity, though its structuring of possibility is not transparent to that entity in its processes of knowing. It's here in reversion, or conceptual imagination, that we have a germinal instance of the freedom or autonomy inherent in an actual entity. The feeling of alternative possibilities is conditioned, as noted above, and perhaps severely so. but the concressing actual entity is the ultimate ground determining which possibility is reverted to and how that possibility is felt or evaluated. That is, imaginative vision, or perhaps better, imaginative impulse, is a basic activity of a self-causing or free entity. And with this germinal freedom comes novelty. As Whitehead writes, quote, "It is this category of conceptual reversion by which novelty enters the world," end quote. So here we can see that imagination is crucial to the open, creative character of the cosmos as seen by Whitehead. But conceptual imagination is a rudimentary form of imagination, a rather extreme extension of the term. So much so that Whitehead only refers to conceptual reversion as conceptual imagination once. Rather, when Whitehead discusses imagination and imaginative feeling, he's almost always operating at the level of propositions. Within this context of propositional feelings, an imaginative feeling is one where the nexus from which the logical subjects are derived is different from the nexus from which the predicative pattern is derived. A predicative pattern is an eternal object, a possibility, a potential determination of fact. There is thus in the imaginative feeling the union of a potential way of being and a collection of subjects, where the potentiality is imputed to and in contrast with subjects from which it was not derived, or at least not wholly derived. In other words, in an imaginative feeling, some actualities are in contrast with a particular possibility, that possibility being arrived at not through the strict consideration of the qualities of the actualities in question. There is, of course, a more technical discussion that may be had here, but I believe I've said enough to make it clear that what I have just described is exactly analogous to Whitehead's use of imaginative generalization in his description of speculative philosophy, save that imaginative generalization rises to the level of conscious imagination. According to this method of speculation, ideas derived from one limited area of experience are expanded and applied to other or broader areas of experience. A pattern or theory derived from one set of actualities is being applied to another with the goal of enriching experience through this contrast. Contrasts unify while preserving difference. This diversity brought into unity of contrast for the purpose of enriching experience is the essence of imagination. In this skeletal form of diversity brought into unity, you'll no doubt recognize a major motif of Whitehead's philosophy, extending all the way to the category of the ultimate. Imaginative feeling is one way that this pattern of unifying diversity while preserving difference occurs within actual occasions. And what imagination offers is the potentiality for richer, more intense contrast than would be available by sticking to a fixed set of facts and the potentials they actually exemplify. In other words, imagination introduces and helps promote novelty by creating contrasts within experience. This happens in two ways. First, the contrast, though imaginatively arrived at, helps illuminate facts about the indicated nexus. This is the way imagination functions in Whitehead's imaginative generalization. We bring something we've learned from biology and apply it more broadly in philosophy or psychology, for example, and that biological insight helps us understand the philosophical or psychological matter more richly. Such an act of reapplication is not easy. There are no rules for taking something from one domain and translating it into another that guarantees success. Hence, it is an effort of imagination and not an algorithm or procedure. Freedom is linked to imagination once again. Now, on to the second way in which imagination helps introduce novelty through the creation of contrasts. A contrast, imaginatively arrived at, functions as a lure for feeling. There's a proposition that calls attention to a possibility in its relevance to fact. That is, imaginative feeling proposes a potential fact, be it true or false. Where truth and falsity are important, and where there's effort towards the truth, we have the case of imagination supporting the pursuit of knowledge that I just described. But imaginative feelings may also illuminate possibilities that do not fit the facts. Such propositions are, strictly speaking, false. But truth or falsity isn't important here. Interest is. And possibilities that are not realized, possibilities that can only be conceived as distant, almost out of reach, can be incredibly interesting. Previously unseen possibilities can gain definition and clarity through imaginative feeling, and as such, they can lure actuality towards their realization. Novelty is on the horizon. For Whitehead, new forms are first realized conceptually and then are transmuted into physical experience. And that was partially a quote from Whitehead. Without conceptual reversion, new forms are never introduced, but forms are only reproduced from what has come before. There might be new instances of old forms, but never forms previously unrealized. No emergence, no creative evolution. Without propositional imagination, new forms never acquire the interest that comes with their potential realization being considered as a possibility for some definite actualities. This interest promotes depth and intensity of experience in the subject, entertaining the imaginative proposition through making possible a contrast between what is and what could be. It also provides a foothold for future actual occasions to also feel this possibility and perhaps work towards its full physical as opposed to conceptual realization. Serving as a conduit for novelty, imagination can shape and guide purpose. This newly directed energy, plus fortuitous circumstances and environmental conditions, can then bring the new form into fact. Something new emerges into the physical world. And these last ideas, particularly the idea that imagination promotes the depth and intensity of experience through heightening the lure of contrast, bring us to the connection of imagination to art and aesthetic experience. For Whitehead, the generic aim of experience is expressed categorially as the aim at intensity and harmony. That is, the aim is at width and depth of experience, or, in the language of Adventures of Ideas, at massiveness and strength of experience. These ultimate ends of experience are aesthetic in the sense that the aim is at heightened feeling, full of variety and difference, and yet held together in the unity of contrast. Such complex feeling is a composition in the way that a work of art is also. For the many different feelings must be felt such that they enhance one another as far as is possible with the minimum of attenuation. Key to the heightening of intensity within experience is an expanded sense of possibility, or in Whitehead's words, the aims at intensity and harmony require realizing the maximum number of eternal objects so far as this can be done artfully, under the conditions of contrast. Thus, imagination is key in developing thick, rich aesthetic experience. For as we just discussed, imagination is the means through which new possibilities are introduced and enhanced in experience. We can draw from John Dewey's Art as Experience to complement this Whiteheadian account by looking at art and aesthetic experience as paragons of imagination in action. For Dewey, aesthetic experience, quote, is experience freed from the forces that impede and confuse its development as experience. Freed, that is, from factors that subordinate an experience as it is directly had to something beyond itself, end quote. This freely and integrally developing experience is what Whitehead describes as harmony. It is also an assertion of individuality, of the value of the immediate experience. An aesthetic experience is an experience, but development occurs within and of a context, an environment, and thus individuality created through the coordination and strengthening of the matters of experience is an embedded relational individuality. Such a relational consummatory experience is the attainment of beauty in Whitehead's sense of harmony and strength of experience. Aesthetic experience is the heightening and intensifying of the process of growing together that constitutes experience generally. The integral processes of experience are intensified and thickened through the felt contrasts between the actual and the possible introduced by imaginative functioning. Thus, imaginative functioning supports aesthetic experience. Works of art support aesthetic experience in the same way, for art objects also function imaginatively. In fact, an art object is an embodiment of imagination whose working provokes imaginative reenactment in others so as to engender aesthetic experience. Dewey writes that in a work of art, quote, "The meanings imaginatively summoned, assembled, and integrated are embodied in material existence that here and now interacts with the self. The work of art is thus a challenge to the performance of a like act of evocation and organization through imagination on the part of the one who experiences it," end quote. This like act of evocation, when successful, enriches the immediate experience of the attentive perceiver by, another quote, "clarifying and concentrating meanings contained in scattered and weakened ways in the material of other experiences," end quote. The clarifying and concentrating of meanings is an imaginative reconstruction of experience that, because it's imaginative, brings possibilities or meanings from the background of experience, often beneath awareness, into a more prominent position of enjoyment and potentially action. In art, past experiences are used to frame possibilities for present appreciation through physical mediation, be it lasting like a statue or ephemeral like a performance of dance or music. I've just got my concluding paragraphs now. Artistic expression requires an imaginative leap on the part of both the artist and the perceiver of art, because what a work of art expresses, the experienced contrast of the actual with imaginatively reconstructed possibilities, constitutes, a quote from Dewey, "a unity of experience that can only be expressed as an experience," end quote. Yet these imaginative leaps are how we begin to redirect desire and purpose, how we can remake activity and thought. In Whiteheadian terms, we might say that works of art are repositories of potentiality. They are thick with symbolic meaning that can provoke imaginative feelings, both propositional and conscious, in those engaged with them. And from these imaginative feelings, there's an immediate enrichment of experience that simultaneously opens the future to new possibilities of experience and meaning and feeling. Opening the future generally involves a criticism of present conditions. This is because the vivid contrast between the actual and the possible in imaginative experience allows for a penetrating critique of the actual. As Dewey writes of the critical power of art, quote, "It is by a sense of possibilities opening before us that we become aware of the constrictions that hem us in and of burdens that oppress," end quote. Thus, activity and thought, desire and purpose may be lured in a new direction. As for the overall place of imagination in Whitehead's philosophy, we see that it's important throughout. An actual occasion is a compositional process, and the strength and liveliness of this composition, which Whitehead calls beauty, is only possible through the functioning of imagination. We see imagination present in the fundamental workings of Whitehead's systematic metaphysics in the category of conceptual reversion. And as we consider more and more complex actual entities, the sophistication of imaginative functioning grows as well, to the point where imagination can be expressed and embodied and thus shared in works of art so as to enrich both immediate and future experience. But from conceptual reversion to artistic expression, the basic function of imagination remains the engagement with alternative or unrealized possibilities so as to promote contrast with actuality and thus enrich immediate experience. As I hope to have convinced you, imagination is crucial for Whiteheadian process philosophy, whether the context be the becoming of actual occasions or the richness of artistic production and appreciation. Thank you.